So welcome to our second discussion of Plato, which is going to focus on some readings from his great dialogue, The Republic. But before I get to those, I want to close the loop a bit on our discussion from last time, especially the so-called theory of the forms, which I know can be hard to grasp, it can be hard to swallow the first time you encounter it. And I want to suggest that a good way to approach the forms is applying the very first selection for our first discussion, which was those kind of 4 pages from the dialogue called the Phaedo, to the second reading from that discussion, which is known as the myth of the cave. And I think that viewing one in light of the other and vice versa will kind of help bring this idea of the forms to life and to light. So to briefly recap the myth of the cave, it's a very bleak atmosphere that Socrates describes as essentially depicting the human condition. At the bottom of the cave are human beings. We are shackled, constrained to look at a wall with our backs to the outside world, and our whole experience of existence consists of images cast by kind of mysterious puppeteers who are behind us and illuminated on the wall, and strange murmuring sounds. And it's only behind us, upwards and outside, that the real world with the sun, with nature, can be found. So I would suggest that the experience at the bottom of the cave is indeed intended to illustrate what day-to-day reality is like. But then the interesting part is what corresponds to the outside world, the world outside of the cave with the sun and the natural world. The way to apply the very first reading from our first discussion to this myth of the cave might be to say the outside world in the cave is the world of the forms. So if at the bottom of the cave one acquires a crude idea of, say, justice from the strange kind of procession of shadows that are playing along the walls, it's only out behind us, up and outside, that true justice, what one might call the form of justice, justice itself, can be found. Same with something like beauty. The array of shadows along the wall at the bottom of the cave might lead to observations like, oh, these shadows were beautiful, those were ugly. Socrates would say that those shadows have nothing to do. It's a totally confused idea of what beauty and ugliness are. It's only if one escapes, turns around, goes up and outside, that one encounters true beauty, the form of the beautiful. Of course, he's not explicit about the way one escapes from the cave. If you do write an essay about it, that might be something for you to explore. Socrates hints at, given that this is he kicks off the discussion about in the myth of the cave by saying it's kind of image for education. Education might be the way to escape the cave, but then it becomes a question of what kind of education. A philosophic education? The so-called theory of the forms is a philosophical idea. Is it through philosophy that you reach the forms? And if so, how does that help us? What kind of philosophy could be so powerful that it leads you to uncover ultimate reality, which is what Socrates seems to be talking about? I could go on and on with questions. One last one I'll leave you with for now touches on one of our terms from our first discussion, ontology, the philosophical study of what really exists. When Socrates talks about forms in contrast to day-to-day reality, is he talking about almost 2 kinds of worlds? As I'm sure you can imagine, a lot of scholarship has been written on that topic, with some people saying, yes, it really does seem like Plato through Socrates is suggesting that there's 2 realms of reality. There's day-to-day reality, which you experience with your senses, and there's a kind of higher reality occupied or set by forms of things like the just itself or the beautiful itself. There are diverging views on how those so-called 2 worlds relate to each other or if Plato even really intends to set up that kind of dichotomy. But needless to say, once you start to reflect on this idea of the forms, I think they become a very rich and very powerful kind of way of thinking about reality on its most fundamental level. And the forms, I think, are going to resurface during our discussion today, which, like I said, comes from the Republic. It's really Plato's most famous dialogue. It's one of the most famous and celebrated works in the history of philosophy. It's not short. It's a good 300-400 pages long, and it touches on many, many questions within philosophy in a very artful and literary way. Like I was saying last time, those are kind of unique trademarks of Plato's writing style. And before I dive into it, I want to share two kind of takeaways I hope we get from today. One is I hope we get an understanding of Plato's conception of justice. That is a key driving concern for the entirety of the Republic, and it's very much complements and is built into what I hope is our second takeaway for today, which is Plato's conception of the ideal city. So we have this ethical discussion about justice and the other virtues on the one hand, and a very political, philosophical discussion about what the most perfect city might be. And these are very much interwoven in Plato's dialogue. So I hope we can get a good beginning sense of both of those. I'm going to share my screen for a few slides today. If you give me one moment. So I want to say a bit about the climate in which the Republic was written. As I touched on in passing last class, Golden Age Athens, as it's come to be known, really arose and flourished after a great war between the Greek city-states and the invading Persian Empire, with the Greeks feeling very triumphant, pretty great about themselves, some might say to the point almost of chauvinism in the ensuing years. Athens and Sparta will have emerged as the dominant cities within the Greek world, with Athens, the city of Plato, on one side, and Sparta on the other. It doesn't take long after this glorious Greek victory against the invading Persian Empire for the Greek city-states themselves to enter a kind of civil war with one another, with Athens leading an alliance on one side against Sparta on the other. So just a few very general traits of these two cities. And we can ask, as we discuss the ideal city in the Republic, what does it have in common with the one city-state from the real world, and what might it have in common with the other? Athens, again, Plato's city, prides itself on being a democracy. It's a place where the arts flourish, not just philosophy, but theater, mathematics, sculpture, painting. It's a port city that is open to the outside world, with traders coming in, bringing goods, bringing ideas. You have Sparta on the other side, which is about as close to the opposite as you can imagine. It's effectively a military dictatorship. Like Athens, it is a patriarchal society. It's really men running the show. Sparta looks down on the arts. They go against its militant culture. It also practices a policy known as xenolasia. Foreigners are forbidden entry into Sparta. So there will be ways of doing trade, but no non-Spartan can enter Sparta. No free exchange of ideas, so to speak. I'll mention very briefly that in the course of this long and very brutal kind of civil war, it's Sparta that comes out on top. And as strange, it's a city that has a lot of strange attributes, ones that would strike us as odd today. But it's also worth noting that it ends up being one of the longest surviving city-states from the ancient world, something like 500 years. One thing that I hope surfaces from this very brief general comparison of Athens and Sparta is that both of these city-states can be conceived in very philosophical terms, and that they themselves and their inhabitants, and especially the people who ruled them, had a very philosophical self-understanding. Athens would have been a place that viewed itself as democratic, not only in the way that rulers were selected, that juries were assembled, but also in a deeper philosophical sense, in contrast to its arch rival Sparta. The flourishing of the arts had a philosophic spirit to it. The Spartans, as crude as they may seem from this kind of general overview I'm giving, would have had a philosophical basis for rejecting the arts. They would have been viewed as antithetical, as harmful to the cultivation of its idea of virtue. And as for virtue, which is one of the kind of key anchor concept to the readings for today, people in Plato's time, thoughtful people in his time, those both in Athens and Sparta and the other Greek city-states, would have thought of the city-state, would have thought of public life, political life, as the arena where virtue are defined, where the virtues are defined, and where they're exercised. So I want to pause for a moment to talk about this word virtue, which comes up a great deal when talking about Plato and his contemporaries, and many subsequent philosophers for that matter. An issue when first encountering Plato and other philosophers is that virtue is just, at least in my experience, not a word you hear tossed around a lot these days. Let's say when a candidate is running for office, if you look at the news coverage of them, and if you look at the campaigns themselves, are the supporters talking about this, that, and the other virtue that the man or woman running for office has? Not so much. When, let's say, in a legal context, when someone is accused of a crime, or will a prosecutor in their opening statements or closing remarks say that the defendant was devoid of virtue and had all of these personal vices? It's not something you hear too much. Maybe when talking about friends, think about if you happen to be praising one friend to another person, do you describe them? Do you praise them as being virtuous? Maybe. She's a reliable friend. He's always there for you in a pinch. Are those kind of things virtues? I like hanging around with this person because they always make me laugh. That's probably not a virtue. But then what is a virtue? I mean, I think a very simple way to start thinking about virtue is that whole discussion of what a virtue is from Plato and other philosophers is a way of getting at a more familiar question: what does it mean to be a good person? What are the characteristics that go into making a good person? But virtue will also have a very special meaning to Plato and his contemporaries. Hopefully that will become a bit clear as we tackle the readings for today. A key virtue in this dialogue, as I've already says, is the virtue of justice. Justice to Plato and his contemporaries being seen as a key goal of human life. Early on in the dialogue, in passages before the first reading for today, the discussion kicks off with different characters, including Socrates, addressing the question, is the unjust or unjust person happier? And this will be a key question for a lot of reasons. The climate in which Plato is writing, in which this discussion is supposed to be taking place, with our star of the Platonic dialogues, Socrates, very much taking the lead, is one in which there's a whole school of thought advocating what we would consider a relativistic view of justice. Justice is something that effectively varies from city to city. We could go back to the previous slide and say, Athens has one conception of justice and the other virtues. Sparta, it seems it would be clear from this list of general attributes, would have a very different conception. There's no way you can say that there's one definition of virtue that applies equally to a democratic patriarchy and to a militant patriarchy. They would have very different ideas of what virtue is. Same with justice. Justice in Athens is presumably going to be very different in its democratic system than justice would be in Sparta's militant system. So the sophists, mentioned them in passing last time, kind of paid lecturers and teachers who would travel throughout the Greek-speaking world and kind of offer wisdom, lessons, will often be seen to advance, yes, a relativistic view. It's, justice cannot be firmly asserted to be one thing or another. It really depends on where you are. So that's the view that's one of the views that Socrates is seemingly going to be fighting against, because toward the beginning of the Republic, in that discussion, Socrates tries to argue the view that the just person is happier than the unjust one. In the course of that conversation, he comes up against, locks horns with, one of the sophists who had a very particular school of thought. His name, not something I'm going to quiz you on, but as an FYI, was Thrasymachus. And he boldly, almost violently asserts a particular definition of justice that goes completely against the point Socrates has been trying to make. Justice is what's advantageous to the stronger. That might seem like a kind of strange slogan, but one way of interpreting it is that success is the only goal of human action. Other sophists, philosophers like Socrates, might run around trying to narrow down, define what virtue is, what it means to be a good person. They might try to argue that the just person is happier than the unjust one. But all of that's nonsense from the point of view of Thrasymachus. When it comes down to it, everyone really knows that not just might makes right. That'd be one way of interpreting the phrase, quote, justice is what's advantageous to the stronger, but success is what life is really all about. And it doesn't matter how you achieve it. We should hold on to that thought, because we might want to reflexively dismiss it and say it's kind of adolescent, crude, but a variation of it will resurface in very powerful form in a reading for a few weeks from now from Machiavelli. So at that point, we can maybe reflect back on this very short quote and ask, what is the difference between Machiavelli and Thrasymachus? Is Machiavelli and Machiavellianism an update to this ancient idea that success is the goal of human action? So Socrates, and one might say Plato through Socrates, want to fight against that relativistic view of those relativistic views of the sophists. And Thrasymachus's very self-centered idea of what the goal of human action is. So hopefully we're getting a sense of the stakes of Plato's treatment of this question of justice. And what Socrates is giving me the impression of is that if he cannot defend the contention that the just person is happier than the unjust one, then Thrasymachus will be unchallenged, that the thesis, the purpose of human action, is simply success, attaining what one wants, cannot be challenged. And it's in the course of this discussion, that's pretty much book one of the Republic. It's a work that's divided into 10 parts, 10, they're called books. The second one is where the discussion about the ideal city really kicks off. And, Socrates, after speaking at great length, defending the idea that the just person is in fact happier than the unjust one, even leaves by the end of book one, Thrasymachus feeling almost ashamed of his own thesis, chimes in and says, this is Socrates, something like, I've gotten so caught up in this discussion about whether the just person is happier or less happy than the unjust one, that I've lost track of what justice itself is. And I'm actually at a loss as to what it is we've been talking about so confidently this whole time. So he launches this tremendous project, which really persists through twists and turns through the subsequent, not all 9 books, but 7 or 8 or so books, trying to define what justice is. And he embarks on that task with a very famous kind of image or metaphor. And this is where your reading for this section begins. Socrates says, to paraphrase, I don't know if I don't know what justice is in a human being, in the human soul, a word we talked a little bit about last time, then maybe I and we, his discussion partners, can recognize it in larger form. The city, he suggests, is the ideal place to locate justice. And Socrates concludes, maybe if we can identify justice in the city, we can identify it and understand it in the human soul, and eventually get back to addressing Thrasymachus's challenge that, in effect, a conventionally unjust person is happier than an unjust one. So I want to pause for one moment to go over a little bit of vocabulary that's probably good to know. The Greek word for city-state, because these are the units of government that we're talking about, is polis. The word for a republic or constitution, which is often translated, given that the word that gives us the title for the Platonic dialogue we're talking about, is politeia. So Socrates has kicked off this discussion saying, let's search for justice in the polis. And that leads him eventually to construct what's often called Plato's ideal city, the republic or politeia, that gives his dialogue its title. And Socrates sets about this task in a very, like all things Socrates does, unique way. You might think that if Socrates has proposed searching for justice in the form of the city state or polis, he would look to a real world one. I mean, there are two great examples that he would have been very familiar with, Athens and Sparta. But instead, he sets about almost creating one from scratch. That has led some commentators, Socrates' decision to kind of construct a city in thought instead of look to a real world one, to attribute a kind of pessimism to Plato's attitude toward human beings. It seems like he's suggesting the perfect city cannot be attained in the real world. And given that he's looking to the perfect city as the locus of the virtues, he might also be suggesting that the virtues cannot be attained in the real world. So it'll become a question when Plato, through Socrates, is talking about this hypothetical or ideal city, how literally are we supposed to take him? I mean, there's a whole school of thought that essentially this 300 or 400 page work discussing an ideal city and the virtues is a kind of great thought experiment. Is it meant to be put into practice or not? Because we're going to discuss in a little bit, the ideal city has a lot of strange characteristics to it. So one word, the kind of thing I might put on a quiz a few weeks from now, that's often used to describe the ideal city in the Republic, is that it's a utopia. It has a Latin derivation. There was a book of medieval thought that had that very word for its title, utopia. And what it means literally is no place. It's an ideal world. So that is a label often put on the Republic or politeia that's discussed in this dialogue. And something for us to keep in mind as we encounter other works of political philosophy that similarly discuss a perfect or best form of government. These will often be considered utopias, non-existent ideal cities, or maybe even empires. And the question is, what are we as students of philosophy supposed to make of them? So as Socrates goes about trying to find virtue in the polis, he makes it from scratch. So in the reading for today, Socrates discusses the origin of the city-state. He says it simply arises due to a need for food, for the sake of being and living, and he depicts people collaborating with one another to satisfy all their needs. Right from the start, he emphasizes that people should stick to one craft each. A leather worker should stick to only leather. A farmer should only do farming. They should not meddle in one another's work. And that becomes a key theme for the rest of the dialogue, and even for a definition of virtue we end up getting later on in it. Pretty quickly, Socrates starts discussing what kind of people should rule this city-state, this polis. And he ends up calling them the guardians, those who defend the polis, this utopia, from its outside enemies. And right away, the question arises, what should their nature be? Which again is, if you contrast, I think this would be one application of this utopia Plato is presenting us with. It's quite a contrast with present day discussions of how our rulers are selected. There's going to be a presidential election in just over a year, or in 2024. What do you pick up from the news in coverage of the candidates? It's like, okay, Joe Biden is a Democratic nominee. We might see a couple of third-party nominees. The Republican presidential debates are taking a lot of attention right now. How do we discuss the candidates on the Republican platform? Do we talk about their nature? Ron DeSantis, do we say that he has one nature? Vivek Ramaswamy, Nikki Haley, they have different natures. I don't think that's quite how we phrase it, but that right away is how Socrates is describing selection of guardians for his ideal city, for his utopia. And he starts right away rattling off characteristics that he says they should have. Those include being sharp at perceiving things, being courageous. The guardians emerge early on as highly militant. They are skilled warriors. And he also says, interestingly, a major theme for the rest of the dialogue, that the guardians should be philosophic, his word, in a very specific sense. So the way he phrases it, it seems like it might be playful. If you had an opportunity to do the reading, and I hope you will, if you haven't already, Socrates compares the guardians in this passage to an animal, specifically a dog. That might be counterintuitive when you're trying to come up with an ideal city and its protectors or guardians. So he says guardians should have the attribute that they're gentle toward their own people, but rough on their enemies. And he says that they're philosophic in the sense that they love knowledge. This kind of playful comparison that just as a dog loves what it knows, it loves its owner, it loves the family and friends that hang around with the owner, it gets angry at what they don't know. If a dog sees a stranger, it'll bark at it, it might attack it. So in that sort of playful sense that Socrates puts on the table, he says guardians are dog-like, they're philosophers. But then that idea of rulers needing philosophic education is something that he takes very seriously in the rest of the dialogue. So Socrates ends up being greatly concerned with the education of the guardians in his incipient, in his burgeoning, his new ideal city that he's talking about. And a long discussion ensues, which Socrates starts talking about how guardians should be raised, taught, what they should be exposed to in terms of influences from the arts, what should be censored in the arts, what they should not be exposed to. And it's in the course of that discussion that we get preliminary definitions of some of the key virtues. One thing to keep in mind is that neither Socrates nor Plato invented these terms. By the time that they were philosophizing, their contemporaries would have identified 4, maybe 5 key virtues. And cultivating these in the guardian class by this stage of the Republic is the focus of the discussion. Courage, moderation, wisdom, and that guiding concern for the whole dialogue, justice, what it is. A 5th virtue that I'll mention in passing, Socrates does not spend much time discussing, but would have been a significant concern to other philosophers, was piety, reverence toward the gods. Socrates doesn't spend a lot of time on it. I think the readings for today include Socrates' attempts at defining these terms. Justice, again, turning out to be probably the most complicated one. We get a definition of courage. We get a definition of moderation and the other virtues. The question for us to ask ourselves, kind of keeping in mind the guiding questions I suggest for any of our readings, are 1, what is this author trying to say? And 2, what do we think about that? In this case, is there anything missing from this list of virtues? If you yourself were trying to come up with a list of virtues or traits of what makes a good person, what would you add or subtract from here? Does someone have to be courageous to be a virtuous person, to be a good person? What does it mean to be wise? That question that I kicked off our previous meeting with. Is there anything that we would add that's not on this list? I think that's a good one to mull over. A key virtue from later thinkers, especially since we're in a Western context, after the advent of Christianity, would be pity, charity, that kind of sphere of context. Those are things that you would never find on a list of virtues being discussed by an ancient Greek philosopher. Compassion is not something that either Thrasymachus or Socrates would praise. Feeling for others. Sure, there's a way that they would probably try to account for generosity to the poor, but it would be very different from Christian and later ideas of compassion. Why is that? Your readings include Socrates' discussions of these terms, but to kind of briefly touch upon them, courage, according to Socrates and his conversation partners in the Republic, comes down to fearing the right thing. Also mentioned now that courage in Aristotle's discussion of the virtues, which we're going to encounter next week, becomes a prime example of what virtue is, a kind of mean between two extremes, fearing the right thing. But more than that to Aristotle. Moderation to Socrates and the others participating in the dialogue seems to be about keeping desires in check, creating a kind of harmony within the soul. Wisdom in the context for the reading for today is a kind of knowledge of how to rule. This is what guardians have to be taught. And justice. Going back to that, I'll mention that the kind of definitions Socrates comes up with through his dialectical approach seem to vary and maybe get refined depending on the context. In the civic context, in which Socrates is talking about the education of the guardians, it seems to be something like doing one's own work and not meddling with what is not one's own. That's a sort of theme that he introduces at the very beginning of his discussion of the ideal city, saying that it starts out with different kinds of craftsmen. And he emphasizes right away, leather workers should only stick to leather. They should, farmers should stick to farming. It would be a disaster if either of them meddled with the occupation and the concern of the guardian class, war, defense of the holies. So an early definition we get of justice, again, is doing one's own work and not meddling with what is not one's own. So what one might say is Socrates' kind of masterstroke in bringing his great analogy between the city and trying to find justice there on the one hand, and the soul and trying to find justice there on the other, is where he ends up dividing his ideal city into different classes and saying each class corresponds to a different part of the soul. So Socrates divides his ideal city into three classes. And as he turns the conversation back to the kind of original question, what is justice in the human soul, he associates each class with a particular part of the soul. The sort of academic term for the model of the soul that emerges from this discussion is the tripartite or three-part soul. In the ideal city, you have the working class on the bottom. the farmers, the leather workers, the others who provide the city with necessities. Traders would presumably also be in the working class. They are said to correspond to the desiring part of the soul, the part that craves food, generates other desires. The next class will be the warriors in the ideal city, those who protect it from enemies and go on the attack. They're said to correspond in that tripartite model of the soul to the so-called spirited part, the part of the soul, the part of us that gets angry when they see something they think is an injustice, or that gets roused when it has to go on the attack or defend itself. And then at the top of the ideal city are the guardians, that ruling class that oversees the government, that attains the city's goals. That corresponds to, in the tripartite model of the soul, the thinking part, the one that does higher mental activity, that philosophizes. The sort of bridge between these classes within the ideal city, on one hand, and the elements of the three-part soul on the other, is a kind of virtue. I think very provocatively, in Socrates' ideal city, the working class does not have a distinct virtue. He does not attribute any special quality to it. That should give us pause, I would think. I'm inclined to say, again, trying to apply whatever it is Socrates is talking about to hypothetically government today, that I know plenty of virtuous working people. Why would Socrates seemingly fail to attribute or ascribe a particular virtue to the working class? So I'm not going to answer that question for us. Presumably he was a highly intelligent philosopher. So why would he think that? Why would he refrain from ascribing a unique virtue to the working class? Again, he's saying that it corresponds to the desiring part of the soul. Is there no virtue that comes from our desiring side? The warriors, unsurprisingly enough, he attributes the virtue of courage. That's the virtue of the spirited part of the soul. The guardians are, of course, the wise part of the ideal city, corresponding to the virtue of the thinking part of the soul. And this wisdom is presumably cultivated through a pretty severe education that I'm going to talk about in the next slide, that Socrates prescribes for the ruling class. There's an elaborate process of kind of evaluating and filtering out, from consideration for being guardians, everyone in the ideal city from an early age. A lot of the Republic is devoted to discussing how do you identify who has the potential to be a guardian? And once that potential surfaces, how do you cultivate the virtues in them, especially wisdom, so that they can be fit to rule the city? Like, now's a good time to mention that what might become clear from this very seemingly rigid organization of the ideal city is that it serves an agenda that would be very different from the agenda that we would typically, I would say, seem to associate with a modern government. In a liberal democracy, which is what we like to think of ourselves as living in today, the purpose of government is often said to be enabling citizens to pursue their own goals, to do what they want, to fulfill their potential, maybe. This ideal city, although it's different from the real world cities that we were briefly introduced to near the start of the class, seems to have a very different purpose. It's not to enable people to fulfill their own potential and pursue their own goals, it might be said to be producing virtuous citizens is the goal of this city. And maybe not everyone can attain the highest virtues, but it'll be designed to empower those with the capacity to attain virtues to do so. And as far as that definition of justice goes, or as far as that idea of justice goes, where is it in both the ideal city and in the soul? For Socrates, in the dialogue, justice surfaces as a kind of all-pervading virtue, both in all classes of the city and in the soul. So justice in the ideal city will surface for Socrates as each of these three kind of occupational groups, the working class or the providers, the warriors, we could also think of as kind of auxiliaries to the guardians, and the guardians themselves doing its own work in the polis. The workers don't meddle with the warriors' work, the warriors don't meddle with the guardians' work, and that's a definition of justice for the ideal city. On the individual side, when Socrates applies this to the human soul, he'll end up saying that individual justice is for each aspect of the psyche to do its own work in the person. The desiring part, the part where the appetite comes from, is sort of held in check through the virtue of justice. This also complements the virtue of moderation. Moderation and justice turn out, according to Socrates, on the level of the individual soul to seemingly have a lot in common. The desiring part is restrained. It's not allowed to interfere with the spirited part when it needs to be courageous. And we can start to imagine how desires might interfere, be a hindrance to the need to be courageous in Socrates' sense of the word. Similarly, the spirited part is kept in check and doesn't interfere with the work of wisdom. Acts of contemplation are allowed to proceed unimpeded by either the spirited part, which can get wild and out of control, or the desiring part. And this might sound very abstract and maybe a little bit lofty, but if we try to think of examples to which we could apply this kind of vocabulary, yes, I can start to see how the desiring part might interfere with the thinking part in particular. I'm supposed to sit down and write an essay that's due on Monday, but I desire 50 other things. It's like, well, if I have the virtues of justice and moderation, I would not allow those desires to interfere with the thinking that I need to do. So one thing that probably becomes clear through this sort of breakdown of the classes in Socrates' ideal city, that it's not very democratic. On the one hand, everyone in the ideal city is, Socrates emphasizes, eligible to eventually become a guardian. But there's a very severe sort of regimen to which all the citizens are subjected, and non-guardian candidates are effectively weeded out. We might consider this a kind of aristocracy. Could debate whether or not this would really lead to the best members of the city-state or polis actually rising to the top. But that's what Socrates seems to be presenting as the best form, the ideal form of government, is that, again, it's an aristocracy. And a tremendous amount of space in the Republic not really in the readings for today, but I just want to mention, is devoted to the education and very peculiar and also rigid kind of lifestyle requirements that Socrates imposes on the guardians. It's the legislative class that determines which people can eventually become guardians. And after a relatively early age, almost everyone has to stay in the same group for their entire life. And in fact, in part of this sort of cruelty that seems to surface in this ideal city, is that children of people who've already been named guardians who are deemed unfit are effectively discarded, tossed aside. It can be very brutal. Their education, again, that crucial point for Socrates in determining who should be deemed fit to rule, entails something we should probably object to: strong censorship of music and the arts. In the course of the discussion, in which kind of tentative definitions of the virtues like courage and wisdom emerge, the context is what influences, especially from Homer, great Greek epic poet, should prospective guardians be exposed to or not. And there's a very famous or infamous long passage in the Republic where Socrates and his conversation partners kind of work their way through Homer and decide what should be allowed to remain in the ideal city and what should effectively be censored. One interesting note, I think it's a great example of how philosophy can lead you to what I would say is a very down and very nonconformist path. Women in the ideal city are equally eligible to become guardians as men. When I mentioned Athens and Sparta, the real world cities from Plato's time, I mentioned that they were both patriarchies, totally male dominated. So in Plato's time, for him to put in Socrates' mouth that women can also become guardians would have been a very radical idea. But Socrates has a very simple explanation for this. The same education which makes a man a good guardian will make a woman a good guardian, for their original nature is the same, is what he contends. Guardians also have what might be considered a communist lifestyle. Property is held in common. There's effectively no private property for the guardian class. I think that is dismissed as potentially corrupting the guardians. That might give us food for thought today. If any of you may have seen over the years, a perennial topic for reporters looking into the Congress is whether or not members of Congress should be allowed to trade stocks. Does that corrupt their lawmaking process? It's like, well, that would be a non-issue in Socrates' polis, because the ruling class is not allowed to have property of its own. They're provided for by the city itself. Also, interestingly, guardians are prevented from knowing who their parents are. Children are raised in common. A lot has been written about whether that's even possible, which touches on the question, how much of this is a thought experiment, how much of it is a real world regimen for actual existing governments. But Socrates says that that way of child rearing would be best for the city. Also, from early on, as we already discussed, Socrates insists that guardians must be philosophers. They are the class that is capable of attaining wisdom, especially of how to rule, and spends much of their education. People in the ideal city are said not to really take office until they're about 40 or so. It's their whole lives up until then are spent in training in music and the arts, albeit highly censored, gymnastic training, but also eventually philosophy. That's what their education is said to culminate with, specifically dialectic, that very particular form of trying to answer philosophical questions that we discussed in our previous session. So the people ruling the ideal city are philosophers and practitioners of dialectic, which might bring us back to the question of forms that we started this discussion with. Dialectic seems to be the path, according to Socrates, to uncovering the forms. Again, I won't repeat it now, but that very unique process of starting out with presuppositions, refining them, reworking them, discarding some, attaining others, that Socrates suggests is the path to uncovering the forms. We might ask those four virtues, those four key virtues that Socrates repeatedly talks about, are these themselves forms? Is it the case that the working class or the warrior class might have a sort of mundane or ordinary idea of courage and the other virtues? They're kind of inhabiting that space in or near the bottom of the cave, but its guardians through philosophy, specifically dialectic, who managed to exit the cave and attain the forms of the different virtues, the form of courage, the form of wisdom, and justice and moderation. So an idea of justice that Socrates leaves the reader with after all of these twists and turns trying to refine what it is ends up being on a personal basis. And it's the definition of justice that I think is supposed to help answer that question: is the just or unjust person happier? So after a great long discussion about what the ideal city is and what its classes are, Socrates brings it back to the individual basis and says, for one human being, justice is not anything connected with doing what properly belongs to oneself externally, but what's on the inside that truly concerns oneself and properly belongs to oneself. I'm not going to read this whole passage, but I think it's worth going over most of it. Just person does not allow each thing in him to do what's alien to it, or the classes of things in his soul to meddle with one another, but setting his own house in order in his very being, he himself ruling over and bringing order to himself and becoming his own friend and harmonizing three things, exactly like the three notes marking a musical scale at the low end, the high end, and the middle. That's presumably the three parts of the tripartite soul: the desiring, the spirited, and the thinking parts. Only when he's in this condition does he act. If he performs any action having to do with acquiring money or taking care of the body, as well as anything of a civic kind or having to do with private transactions, in these cases, he regards an action that preserves that condition of being just and helps to complete it as a just and beautiful act and gives it that name, and regards as wisdom the knowledge that directs that action. Anything that breaks down that condition, he regards as an unjust action, and the opinion that directs that he regards as ignorance. So it's interesting to me how in this very rich passage, Socrates not only gives a kind of definition of justice as this particular internal condition, but also presents it as a way for guiding all actions that you might have with other people. He seems to be talking about. You won't engage in business or do anything in private. Think about all the whole universe of activities that happen in private. How you treat your friends, how you treat acquaintances, how you act on dating apps, maybe, what you do to land a job, how you make purchases, take out a car loan, take out a mortgage, use a credit card. It says this definition of justice, according to Socrates, can guide all of that. It's that if you do an action that keeps the parts of your soul in harmony that act will be just and indeed beautiful. As a side note, the beautiful is a key term for Aristotle, which we'll see next week. And any action that detracts from that kind of internal harmony that the virtue of justice is said to yield will be an unjust action that you should refrain from. So all this might seem very abstract, but I think it is possible, and this will address the question, to what extent is this a great thought experiment? And to what extent is it kind of real world advice? Can start to answer that by trying to bring real world examples to bear on it. Do I use ChatGPT to write an essay? This is something that should not be done. It's like, well, does it contribute to a virtuous and just condition of the soul? Might be Socrates' answer to that question. More in the vein of that question, is the ideal city a real world program that political philosophy of Plato and Socrates is giving us or not? And in the course of the dialogue, there are many moments in which Socrates, who seems to be giving an example of dialectic, does draw objections from his conversation partners. So the readings for today, in most of them, it's Socrates doing the talking and his conversation partners mostly agreeing with him or occasionally objecting. But there are a few moments where they're incredulous, they're disbelieving. The moment when Socrates says women should be equally eligible to become guardians as men, that draws kind of surprise and initially derision from Socrates' conversation partners until he persuades them that women are equally capable of ruling. Later on in the dialogue, after Socrates has depicted this incredible ideal city with all of these unique attributes, one of his discussion partners objects. I've never seen anything like this in the real world. And to paraphrase, he's skeptical it could ever come to be. And so Socrates replies, maybe it's a pattern laid up in heaven for anyone who wants to see it and wants to establish it in oneself. It makes no difference whether it is or ever will be present anywhere, because one's actions will be those that belong to this city alone and to no other. Lots of ways to interpret this phrase, especially this reference to heaven. Is he talking about a world in which the forms exist? That, to me, is an open question. But what he seems to be encouraging his audience to think is that even if you think that this ideal city he spent all this time talking about could never come to be, you should act as though you are a member of it. And that is what would make you a virtuous person. So on that note, I think I'm going to share some kind of questions to get you to continue thinking about the readings for today. I might give one of the essay prompts that I'm going to give in a few weeks. We'll probably touch on some of these, but for now, I would ask you, what are the most appealing and least appealing things about the ideal city? I think we saw a lot of both today. Do you think the idea, or I should say ideas, of justice described in the Republic are adequate or inadequate? And lastly, if someone wanted to put the virtues described in the Republic into practice, how would he or she do so?